Greetings, everyone. Today I'm going to discuss a topic, and that's about ancient history, fairy tale or reality. Now, a lot of people don't believe what's in ancient history, and it's understandable because there are many conflicting stories. But here's the thing that sets the Bible apart from fiction, and much of folklore and legend in general. You see, fictional accounts have an author. All fictional accounts have their origins traced back to a single person or group. But folklore and legend is different. Instead, different variations of the same subject are mentioned. Even if the exact subject is traced back to a single group, most of the time there are subjects that are very similar in other areas of the world. Supreme deities, demigods, goddesses, monsters, angels, demons, giants, dragons, ghosts, aliens, Nephilim, mermaids, fairies, elves, trolls, etc. These beings had to come from somewhere, and some of these beings can't be explained naturally, so that means they don't exist, right? No, it just means they aren't the result of evolution. Are they all just fairy tales then? Well, no. It could just mean that they were made by advanced beings, maybe even spiritual beings. So who's the person that said that the supernatural doesn't exist? First, what people do is that they start with the conclusion, the assumption that there is no such thing as supernatural beings. From there, they remove elements or characters that are closely associated with the supernatural, taking these elements and then making a fictional story out of them. From there, the media makes the conclusion that the supernatural itself is fictional. I'm telling you, what you see in the movies and all sorts of media is just a diluted version of the real thing. Fact is, there is evidence and has been evidence of these things being the real thing. These sightings and reports around the world, and yes, I'm referring to the small percentage that cannot be explained, and yet these small percentage is still enough to generate thousands of sightings every year. Sightings and experiences of the very beings we read about in folklore and legend. But those are already explained, right? They're just delusions. You might say, well, if everything you say is true, there should be evidence. You're right, and there is evidence. It's all around us. These giant artifacts, dinosaur fossils, tiny skeletons, giant skeletons, paranormal activity, cryptids, unusual rock formations, and of course, ancient history. All those stories that have made it up to present time. Now, there are hoaxes out there, and a lot of them, but it's foolish to only focus on the hoaxes. That's cherry picking. I'm looking at you, mainstream media. Let me keep it brief. I made a video about paleontology and rock dating, and the overall conclusion is that when it comes to fossil remains, they rarely find complete skeletons, so they rely on modern animals and previous skeletal findings to build these creatures that we see in the museums. Did you know that there are acres of land around the world that are off limits? Did you know that there are various places on Google Maps and Earth that are censored? And for what? We all know this, and we also know they have their reasoning. But is it possible that there are reasons that are not disclosed to the public? And if so, what are they? See, we don't know what's there, and we should all accept the fact that our governments regularly lie to us. Would it be any surprise that in some of these restricted areas there are ruins, artifacts, and even skeletal remains of these creatures we read about in folklore and legend? And if that is so, then why wouldn't they be willing to rewrite history? Why would they decide to hide their reports, especially if many scientists claim that if they truly did find these things, they would report it? First, because they already have a written record that they are pleased with. Second, because of popularity. If a finding had an object that has already, let's say they find the skull of a mammoth, but it's attached to a very large human skeleton, and ancient history does testify of giant humanoids that had tusks. However, modern science already has a skeletal reconstruction where this skull is attached to a large elephant-like creature. So the former would no doubt cause controversy, especially if there are a lot of these controversial findings. So instead of simply rewriting their history, they would rather discard their findings. Same rule applies to Neanderthals, dinosaurs, giant sloths, mastodons, etc. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Let me tell you something about science. Science in itself is knowledge. The word science comes from the Latin word scientia, which means knowledge. Yes, what you call pseudoscience is science, but it's not natural science. Dismissing it as completely unscientific ignores the whole picture. Geology, paleontology, chemistry, physics, archaeology, astronomy, those are all natural sciences. What if I told you that something like young Earth creationism is not a natural science? In fact, it's not meant to be taken as a natural science at all. So what is it? It's a spiritual worldview that looks at science with a supernatural foundation. In this case, the Bible. We already know that we can't prove God with natural sciences. That's just a fact. It merely presents the data, and it's up to the person to interpret that data. To those who don't believe there's a God, no amount of data will convince them. But you can still use logic and reasoning. That's literally what makes science what it is, using logic and reasoning to understand the world around us. If there really is a supernatural reality, then no amount of natural science can disprove it. But it is possible for people to be misled by the natural science and explain supernatural phenomena naturally. Tree rings, ice cores, radioactive decay, time, radiation, light speed, evolution. To say the universe is much older than 12,000 years is entirely based on present observation, based on assumption that they have remained constant. Assuming. Anyway, just having natural data alone doesn't explain exactly where we came from. There needs to be a foundation to establish that data in a certain manner, in a way that is consistent and makes sense. And this is exactly what the evolutionary worldview does, its foundation being naturalism. Young Earth creationism involves a supernatural foundation, namely the Bible, but other creation myths can make a case for a young Earth too. So you have all these creation myths, right? Meaning that the natural data can be aligned according to these myths. But you can't have multiple foundations as being absolute truth. That won't work. And it's much more controversial to pick one instead of just dismissing all of them. Or take the global flood legends we hear about around the world. Those 200 legends could mean that many different variations, they all point to the same event. But again, it's controversial to pick one, then dismiss all of them. This would mean a lot of rewriting to do. It would mean rewriting geology, biology, and many other things that we have worked for centuries to accomplish. Is it any wonder they don't want to rewrite it? And not only that, but it would also mean rewriting history to include the supernatural. And here's the problem. Resulting to religion, spiritual beings, and ancient historical texts as the foundation for natural sciences rather than naturalism, that is a very radical step. The controversy comes because of the acknowledgement of needing to rewrite their science. They don't want to do this, clearly. We also have people who are against religion as well as those who stand up for it. But fortunately for them, they have a rule which states that anything that is not natural science is not mentioned in the equation of science. Unless these rules exist, the mainstream scientific community would be much more toxic and chaotic than it is today. At this point, there is no confusion. This should be clear to everyone listening to this presentation. Now, why in their right minds would any government or scientist want to hide something like the supernatural from us, or refuse to include it within the equation of science? For 3 reasons. 1, to keep the public sane. This is understandable, as most of these ancient civilizations perished because these supernatural beings led people down a very dark road of madness. So in a way, what mainstream science is doing is actually a protection for our own well-being. But understand, the people in power, they do believe it, and they acknowledge its existence. They're the same people who set these rules out for the public, mainstream science to follow. 2, to main power. This one is very controversial, as it highlights the apparent arrogance and self-interest in mainstream science. 3, to reduce controversy. And who said that the truth isn't controversial? Actually, if people weren't so resistant to something true that doesn't appeal to their senses, then maybe it wouldn't be that controversial. So in conclusion on feeling like when it comes to anything, whether the Bible or any creation myths, when it comes to just feeling like those are just fairy tales, that's all it is. A feeling. And feelings don't define reality. The question is, are we interpreting all this data around us correctly?